Hello. We will give you a feedback about the second week of the course. During this week, you learned about the measurements of inequality and segregation, about the vicious circle of segregation, and you also got the first insights of what can urban design do. And the coming weeks will be exclusively about the urban design at different spatial levels. So, previous week, we asked you to check what is the Gini index of your country. Gini, as you already know, represents income inequality. And many of you, when reporting the numbers, recognized important shortcomings of this measurement. Martin, could you highlight a few most important issues of Gini? Of course, maybe despite the fact that it's still a good measure and the best what we have for a global comparison.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Ruta. So yeah, indeed, the Gini index is a internationally recognized measure for inequality. And the power of Gini is that the Gini index is standardized and it's available for many countries and is updated on a really regular basis. So you can make really nice time series of the Gini index. So the Gini index in that sense is perfect for making international comparisons of inequality. And the Gini index is also really useful if you want to look at changes over time within one country, for example. But if you just simply Google Gini index and limitations, you will also see many different limitations of the Gini index. And there's also many alternative measures that have been developed. But just to mention a few, also in relationship to the book that we use for this MOOC, the Gini index is generally available for whole countries, and in our case, we're often interested in inequality in a city or in cities. And city level Gini index information is often not available from many places. So often what we do is we look at the Gini index of a country, and then we look at the level of segregation in a city. And that's of course problematic because if you look at, for example, OECD data on the Gini level of cities, because there's some Gini city level information available, there's huge variation of the Gini index between cities within a country. So the Gini is great for comparisons, but one of the shortcomings is that it's often only available for countries and not for cities. Another limitation of the Gini index is that it focuses on income inequality. And you could also argue that it's not just income inequality that we should look at, but also inequality in terms of wealth. And we can spend probably a whole MOOC on the question of how to measure inequality, because income inequality is important, wealth inequality is important to look at. And then if you look at wealth inequality, there's also issues on whether you include home ownership in those measures, or whether you include the value that people build up in their pensions, if they have pensions. And that's important again, because in some countries, people hardly build up a pension. In other countries, people do build up a pension. Some countries, there's hardly any home ownership. In other countries, there's a lot. So all these issues affect, again, the level of inequality that you measure in different ways. One other important issue with Gini is that the Gini can be quite sensitive with regard to the demographics of a country. So, for example, in a country with a very high level of aging population, or in a country with a really young population, so a country where there was a huge baby boom, for example, the Gini index can be misleading because in countries with a very aging population, the Gini index often turns out to be higher. The Gini index suggests that levels of inequality are quite high, but in reality, the level of inequality among the working population can be relatively modest. But if there's lots of elderly people or lots of really young people, then the Gini index can give a slightly biased, skewed image. So Gini index is great, but you always need to look at it with caution.
The assignment for this week was to draw a simple mental map which shows where the rich and the poor people live in your city. You also had to present the part and scene in your drawing. So Martin, could you find some global trends in all the assignments?
Of course, it's very challenging looking at the diversity of maps. I mean, to start with, I was really impressed with all the mental maps that we've seen. The richness of information in the maps. Of course, the maps are very different. Some people have been really amazingly creative, drawing their cities, or sketched their cities, made conceptual models of their cities. But yeah, very impressive what everyone did, and a wealth of information. It's difficult to draw strong conclusions on the maps that we have seen. Also because it requires quite a lot of in-depth knowledge of a city to understand the spatial patterns. But there's a few interesting things I think that can be found from these maps. One of them is maybe very obvious, but maybe for some it isn't, and that's simply the question: what is your city? So we didn't specify that very in a lot of detail because it's a mental map. So it's a map of your idea of your city. But if we think about cities and inequality, then often it really makes sense to take a really broad perspective of the city and its suburbs. So more like an urban region, because within a city, levels of inequality can be fairly limited, and there might not be that much segregation going on. But if you compare the city to the wider urban region, there might be huge levels of inequality, because, for example, the middle classes or the higher incomes live in the suburbs, or poverty has moved to the suburbs. So your understanding of segregation and inequality in a city partly depends on how you define the city. That came out, for example, in the map of Amsterdam, which takes it's a very good map, but it takes a narrow conception of the city just to the municipality, ignoring all the suburbs and the municipalities around it. I think another observation from the maps is that wealth is often much more concentrated than the middle classes and poverty. And this makes sense because, of course, the wealthy group is relatively small, but also people with money, households with money, can buy the best locations, the best neighborhoods, the best houses that are available in the city. And with their money, they often concentrate in certain parts of the cities, which they find attractive, safe, with good access to amenities. So it's interesting to see that, for example, in Beirut, the higher incomes really concentrate around the coastal area. In some other cities like Campo Grande, but also the city in Bolivia, and for many of the examples, the rich are concentrating in relatively small areas of high concentrated wealth. So we know from the research that we did in the book that's made available in this book that it's the rich in a city that often determine the spatial patterns of segregation, because the rich have money to choose the best locations. And the rich often choose attractive coastal areas, attractive old historic city centers. And in some cases, the rich choose to concentrate in gated communities and enclaves, maybe at some distance from the city, but in an environment which is both attractive, accessible, but also a safe environment, sometimes even walled areas with private guards, so really gated communities. And I think that's what we see back in some of these maps as well. Wealth concentrates in smaller areas, and often close to city centers or close to attractive coastal regions.
Yeah, of course, and it's a very diverse set of case studies.
Yes. Yeah, but that makes it really interesting, and that's I think also really interesting in the book that we made, that there's such a huge diversity, but at the same time it is possible to see some common patterns in all these different case studies. But you really need to understand a city well and talk to people who know the city well to fully appreciate the spatial patterns that you see, because a lot of the spatial patterns of poverty and wealth are strongly rooted in the history of a city, the historic development of a city. and sometimes even on the physical geography of cities. Where, for example, in Tokyo, the higher income populations live on higher ground, on solid rock and on higher ground, which is much safer in case of an earthquake and a tsunami than when you live in the lower lying areas where there were previously swamps with much less stable ground. So the physical geography of a city sometimes determines the distribution of rich and poor, even nowadays.
Thank you very much for this discussion, and enjoy the rest of the MOOC. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.